Good evening. Hope everyone had a good Christmas, and I'm glad it's warmed up a little bit, for a little while anyway. I'll live in glory. I'd like to stay here longer than man's allotted days and watch the fleeting changes of life's uneven ways. But if my Savior calls me to that sweet home on high, I'll live with him forever in glory by and by. Oh yes, I'll live in glory by and by. I'll tell and sing the story there on high. There with my dear Redeemer, no more to die. Oh yes, I'll live in glory by and by. The end I know is nearing. By faith I look away to yonder home supernal, the land of endless day. I'll cling to him forever and look beyond the sky and live with him forever in glory by and by. Oh yes, I'll live in glory by and by. I'll tell and sing the story there on high. There with my dear Redeemer, no more to die. Oh yes, I'll live in glory by and by. Hope to God's unchanging hand. Time is filled with swift transition. None of our thunder can stand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Trust in him who will not leave you. Whatsoever years may bring, if by your plans forsaken, still more closely to him cling. When your journey is completed, if to God you have been true, fair and bright the home in glory, your rapture so shall view. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Oh, to God's unchanging hand. Build your hopes on things eternal. Oh, to God's unchanging hand.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for being here tonight. I hope everyone had a great Christmas. I know I did. The best thing about Christmas is getting to see your family, and I was able to do that, so that was indeed a blessing. If you are joining us live or later, thank you. I hope this class on Daniel strengthens your faith and honors your time. Last week, we studied Daniel chapter 1, which introduced the central figures of God, Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar. And we looked at how God gave Nebuchadnezzar victory over Judah and how he deported Daniel and his companions. And the young men were trained in the royal court of Babylon. And like chapter 1, Daniel 2 is a chiasm. So this is a chiasm. We talked about this a couple of weeks back. And we can see how verses 1 through 13, the king's dream is concealed to his advisors, and at the end of the chapter, the king's dream is revealed by Daniel. Here's the second level. Daniel requests an audience with the king, and then Daniel's granted an audience with the king. And the last is God reveals a dream to Daniel. And this is on your handout, so if you're taking pictures or trying to jot that down, it's on the handout if you picked one of those up. This outline is adapted from Dr. Joe Sprinkle, and on your handout, let me just briefly talk about what you have here. on the front page, I've got the passages, all the passages that I'm going to read from potentially tonight that are not found in Daniel chapter 2. So I hope you have your Bibles with you. If you don't, there are Bibles under the pews. I typically will be reading from the English Standard Version, so if you're following along electronically, that's the version that I typically use. But anything that I'm not reading from Daniel 2 will be on this side of the page. There's also a diagram we'll talk about later. On the back side, I have a list of references. And these are references that I use, that I've been able to acquire over the course of time in preparing these lessons. And I've got some recommendations related to those if you're interested in expanding your library or digging further. As is the case whenever you teach, there's a whole lot more that you learn that you just don't have time to talk about. And I'm happy to talk about any of the things I present after class if I don't hit them during class. So that's about the handout, and we may or may not have handouts every week. It just depends. And the slide deck tonight is short. There was a piece that I talked about last week and a couple weeks ago about regnal dates. And I wanted to give this to you as well. I may put this on a handout in the future. This is a list of all the regnal dates that Daniel mentions in the book. You can see that they all show up in the first verse of these various chapters. And whenever you start discussing the time that the book was written, these are points of interest that will be discussed typically. And I have some material related to verse 1 of this chapter as well tonight. I don't know how much time we're going to have at the end of the class to go into any dive on that, but I do have some information on that as well. So, back to this chiasm. The heart of this chapter is right in the middle, C. And if you were here for Sunday's lesson when Dylan Armstrong presented his message, he talked about the sandwich and how the sandwich, the most important piece of information is in the middle of the sandwich. If you have a turkey sandwich, you don't talk about the bread, you talk about the inside. Chiastic structure is the same way. It always leads to the most important piece of information. And this is the center of the chapter. The biblical center. Daniel's prayer is there, and the point of those particular verses when we get there is that God is a revealer of mysteries. So that's the heart of the chapter. So this chapter is masterfully constructed when you look at it. In addition to the chiasm, Daniel's account creates tension as you read the passage. He creates tension in two ways. First, he raises the stakes. And second, he withholds information from the reader. Specifically, the information that he will withhold is the contents of this dream. He's going to tease you all along as you read about this dream, and you're going to see that it's important, but he's not going to reveal the contents of the dream until much later in the chapter. In fact, tonight we're going to get up to verse 25, and we're not going to talk about the contents of the dream, because you'll have to come back next week for that. Chapter 2 is a big chapter. It's twice as long as chapter 1. So he withholds information, and this is a powerful narrative technique. This is something that keeps you reading a book, it keeps you watching a TV show, it keeps you watching a movie, withholding information, and that's what he does. The whole time you're reading, you're wondering, well, what did the king dream about? What was that dream about? And finally, he eventually gets to it. When Daniel returns to Nebuchadnezzar, he could have told Nebuchadnezzar the dream right away. He's going to meet with the king. But the thing that he does first is he tells him about God. And he tells him about the power of God and the wisdom of God and God's ability to reveal these things. This is the core idea that he's trying to relay to the king. The contents of the dream are important, but God is more important. This same structure is the same type of thing that Joseph does in Genesis chapter 41. And there are a lot of parallels between this chapter and Genesis 41. Okay, so briefly, let's talk about time reckoning. And we talked about this last week, that there's two different methods that are used of reckoning the regnal dates for a king. And one is you say that the first year of that king starts whenever that king becomes king. Okay, the accession year counts as their first year, or you can use the method where the first year doesn't count as the accession year. It's the accession year, but it doesn't count as the first year. And here you have this particular approach being used. So this information is from Dr. Paul Tanner, who has a fabulous commentary. It's very big. And this is one of the approaches that they use to harmonize verse 1 of chapter 1. And let me talk about that just briefly. Let's read the verse. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 1. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. Okay, what's going to happen is he's going to try to kill all the wise men, and Daniel and his companions will be living in a house somewhere in Babylon, but this is the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, and there's some question about, well, if that's the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, how is it that Daniel and his companions are not in training? Because they were in training for 3 years. And so that's the whole regnal date problem. All I want to cover on this one right now, because we've got a lot of material for tonight, I just want to mention that from a high level, there's different ways to harmonize this, and this is a recognized way by many of the scholars that I've looked at to harmonize the material. So if we have time, I can get into that, or I can also point you to additional materials related to this. Okay, we're going to skip ahead to this blank. So, chapter 2 introduces Daniel as God's dream interpreter for the kings of Babylon. And again, verse 1, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, his spirit was troubled, and his sleep left him. The king's dream left him sleepless, and literally, it's translated that his spirit was struck, as if you struck an anvil or you struck a bell. His spirit was struck by a hammer, is the idea. And God discloses his will in this dream, and he works on the king's anxiety. And we're reminded of Proverbs 21, it's on your handout. Proverbs 21:1, the king's heart is a stream of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he will. Remember, the dominant theme of this book is God's sovereignty. God is sovereign, and he is in control of kings, kingdoms, and indeed has impact on everyone's lives. So upon experiencing this dream, Nebuchadnezzar is deeply troubled, he's unable to sleep, and he recognizes at some level that the dream's origins are supernatural. And so he summons the experts of Babylon. Verse 2, then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Now, these are 4 different terms that are used for people that have professed some understanding of the spirit world. And we'll briefly talk about each of these. It's a fascinating thing to look at. But what happens later in the book is that these get used interchangeably. So don't hang too much on these definitions. So the 4 different words, magicians. Now, the magicians here are not illusionists like you think of. David Copperfield, David Blaine, Harry Houdini. This is not the word that's used here. In fact, the word is the same word that's used in Genesis 41, talking about the Egyptians that Joseph deals with. And it also is a similar word that's used in the book of Exodus when Moses is dealing with the plagues, and we'll look at a verse related to that as well. The word refers to Egyptian priests that were skilled at interpreting dreams. It's the same as in Genesis 41, And archaeologists have found Egyptian dream books or scrolls that date to the reign of Ramses the Great in the 13th century. And when Nebuchadnezzar invaded Egypt, remember, he went across the Fertile Crescent, came down through into Carchemish and attacked Pharaoh Necho, and then he went down through Palestine, through Judah, captured Jerusalem, and went through, and he attacked Egypt. When he did this, he may have taken Egyptian dream interpreters back to Babylon with him. So that's one of the words. Another word that shows up is enchanters. This is also translated astrologers or diviners. And these are also priestly advisors who interpreted signs. They communicated with the spirit world using incantations. And enchanters are also called charmers or exorcists. And it was believed by the Babylonians that an enchanter could cure a nightmare. And that's what this dream is. We use the word dream, but this is something that terrified King Nebuchadnezzar. That's a nightmare. So the enchanters were believed to have cured nightmares. Sorcerers, the practice of sorcery and witchcraft is universally condemned in the Bible, and they were employed by the court, again, because it was believed that they had extra knowledge about the spirit world. The Chaldeans, this is an ethnic group that originated from southern Babylon. The word is Kasdim, and it was a ruling caste that Nebuchadnezzar's father came from, King Nabopolassar. He belonged to the Chaldeans, and these individuals were scholars, and the word Chaldean, especially as used in the book of Daniel, eventually became synonymous with someone who was able to divine the future or have deeper understanding of the spirit world. The Chaldean scholars carefully recorded movements of the heavenly bodies, and they were so good at this that around 500 BC, they calculated the exact length of a year within 27 minutes. So this is not some hack that he's summoning here. This is a scholarly individual. They have a set of beliefs that we don't agree with, but they had a set of practices that they used. They understood math, and they understood things about the solar system in the ancient times that led them to these kinds of calculations. So, again, the book of Daniel uses some of these words interchangeably to identify the spiritual advisors that the kings use. So verse 3, and the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Now, do you remember at the beginning of this class, we talked about the book of Daniel is written in two languages. It begins and ends in Hebrew, and in the middle, it's Aramaic. Verse 4 is where this shift occurs. Daniel weaves it into the narrative. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Now we're in the Aramaic section of the text. And the Aramaic will continue through the end of chapter 7. The Aramaic section is also a chiasm. And your handout from week 2 has that charted. So you can go back and look at it. So this chapter is a chiasm. That section is a chiasm. The entire book is a chiasm. There's also in the reading next week, if you carefully read what we're not going to cover early on in the verses, and I won't tell you where it is, there is a 2-verse chiasm. If you'll read carefully, you'll be able to find it. So the text transitions to Aramaic, and a Hebrew who's reading this passage for the first time, who reads this chapter, is instantly going to think about Joseph. He's going to think about Genesis 41, where Pharaoh immediately shares the dream with Joseph. That's his response. Joseph winds up, he's a nobody, he's in prison. Pharaoh, he comes to Pharaoh, out of the prison, and Pharaoh immediately tells him the dream. Here, Nebuchadnezzar tells his people that he's had a nightmare, and what do? It's customary to ask him about the dream. What was this that you dreamed? Some propose that Nebuchadnezzar couldn't recall his dream, and all of us can relate to this, where you've had a dream and you couldn't remember what you dreamed. You just knew you had one. And this is a possibility. There's some debate about it. It doesn't change our interpretation of the scripture here. There was a Babylonian omen that claimed that if you could not recall a dream, your God must be angry with you, which is kind of an interesting idea. So, verses 5 and 6, the king makes demands. To prove their interpretations are true, Nebuchadnezzar demands that they tell him the dream and its interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation." He puts them on notice. Tell the dream and its interpretation, and fail, and you're going to be dismembered. Literally, this means that you shall be made into body parts. You shall be made into body parts. And since we're here, let's skip ahead to this. I want to show you, this is from the gate of Shalmaneser III. Now, Shalmaneser was an Assyrian king who, if you remember the empires, they're alphabetical: Assyria, Babylon, Persia. We're in the Babylonian era right now, but about 100 years before that, you have Shalmaneser. Here's this bronze band from the gate of Shalmaneser, and from the right-hand side to the left, on the right-hand side, you can see heads. Okay? These are the heads of enemies that have been cut off that are there. Next to that is a figure of a man who is impaled on a pole. Okay? Brutal. Absolutely brutal. Impaled on a pole. And then beside that is a living victim who's being dismembered alive. You can see below the figure are his hands and his feet. Okay? The Assyrians meant business. And the reputation that they had when they went in to conquer a city or conquer a nation was so terrifying that there were individuals that would just surrender when they arrived, because they didn't want this to happen to them. Of course, this is propaganda, right? This is propaganda circa 700 BC. I mean, you think about propaganda, you look at the pyramids and all of the statues and everything that was built. This is propaganda to scare people. So, the king is not using hyperbole when he threatens to dismember them. This is not a figure of speech. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand." Did I skip a page? I may have. Yes. Let me go back here. Okay, we were at verse 6. Okay, and he promises to give them rewards if they will interpret the dream. But who cares about the rewards? He's threatened us all with death if we don't interpret. Verse 7. They answered the second time and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation." They're going to ask one more time. There's going to be 3 rounds of this. And as a modern reader, can't you relate to Nebuchadnezzar a little bit? Being skeptical about their ability to interpret dreams. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is a skeptic, but he's also superstitious, right? He builds a temple to Marduk. He names his children after Marduk. He's got these superstitions, but he's a practical individual. He's got to be thinking, well, if I tell them the dream, what are they going to do? They're going to go back and consult their manuals. They're going to collude. And they'll all come back and give me the same story, and I'm not going to have any way to know if this is the real interpretation or not. No, you tell me the dream. Tell me what this means, and if you can do that, I will know that your interpretation's true. This is exactly what he does to them. Verse 8 and 9, the king answered and said, I know with certainty that you're trying to gain time because you see that the word from me is firm. In other words, he's not going to change his command. If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. Now, Sennacherib, who predated Nebuchadnezzar by 100 years, once divided his diviners into two groups so that he could compare their interpretations. So this is not without precedent to be skeptical about your advisors. So here, the mouths of the spiritual advisors are going to announce what I call a divine showdown. We see a divine showdown in the cases of Exodus repeatedly whenever Moses is going to Pharaoh, and every single one of those plagues targets an Egyptian deity. Every one of those plagues. And it's a divine showdown between God and their false god. Here, they're going to announce the divine showdown. Watch this, verse 10. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. We're reminded of Moses and the plague of gnats. Now, if you recall, that's the third plague. And the magicians in Egypt are able to reproduce the first and second plagues that occur. Blood, frogs. But the gnats come and the magicians cannot reproduce this plague. If you've looked at images of Egyptian deities, one of the Egyptian deities that they have is Thoth, and he looks like he's got a mosquito for a head. And Thoth was the Egyptian god of magic. And in that case, God's not going to let the magicians replicate anything. And Pharaoh's magicians wind up becoming the mouthpiece of God. In Exodus 8, verse 18 and 19, this is on your handout, the magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast. Then the magician said to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God. This is the finger of God. And the Chaldeans here in Daniel accused Nebuchadnezzar of being unreasonable. No man on earth can do this. Only a God can do this. Furthermore, the gods don't dwell with men. This is a divine showdown. A divine showdown. And this fuels Nebuchadnezzar's anger. Now in chapter 3, we're going to see his wrath exemplified in the fiery furnace, right? An external symbol of the wrath of Nebuchadnezzar. And recall again, what's central to Daniel here is the sovereignty of God. God's hand is at work in all of this. He's setting up the showdown. And God did this before with Pharaoh. Every plague was a judgment against one or more specific gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and they had many. The plague of darkness, if you recall that one, targeted sun gods. The death of the firstborn targeted Osiris and Anubis. Now, Osiris was a god who was resurrected. Anubis was the jackal-headed god. If you've seen images of Pharaoh Tut's tomb when it was excavated. There's these black dogs that are in there. Those are symbols of Anubis. And the first time I found this verse and recognized the import of it, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Exodus 11, verse 7. But not a dog shall growl against any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. I've got this on a slide. Not a dog shall growl. Now, you're reading this as an American, you're going, okay, that's nice. The dogs aren't mean to the Israelites. No! This is a direct reference to Anubis. Not a dog shall growl. So, there's this showdown. And God says in Exodus 12, verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. Okay, so the court officials here in Daniel confess that their arts are limited, and the dream interpretation depends on the dreamer's report. Verse 11, the thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. God's about to announce his presence through Daniel. We're going to hit that next week, but he's going to announce his presence through Daniel. And at thus the kings had it. Verse 12, because of this the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Why is he so angry? Think about this. Here you are, king of Babylon, king of this vast region, and you have all these individuals that are in your employ who are supposed to be experts, and they can't tell him what his dream was or the interpretation. Why is he paying them? Why are they there? And he is so enraged that he commands not just these people that are here talking to him, he commands that all the wise men, all of them, be destroyed. This is not an idle threat. And Daniel and his companions are part of this class of wise men at this point. They're not present when these events occur, when this dialogue happens. So now we get to Daniel's discretion, verse 14. And Daniel is extremely cool under pressure in this situation. 14 through 16. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard. Did I skip a verse? Feels like I did. No. 13. Yeah, okay. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. We'll talk about Arioch and his title in a minute. He's not just the king's captain of the king's guard. He declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel, and Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint him a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Arioch is captain of the king's guard, and in this event, he's also the chief executioner. Slayer. He's the slayer. And he is sent with men to slay these individuals, and he's sent to Daniel. And Daniel requests an audience with the king and obtains a time to interpret the dream. Back to this outline, here he is requesting an audience with the king. That's where we are right now. Daniel responded to this crisis in a way that would surprise most people. And he responds to this crisis with prayer. Now, to a believing Christian, this is not a surprise. But to the world, this is a surprise. Right? He responds with prayer. Prayer is a sub-theme of Daniel. It runs through the book. And if you recall Daniel in the lion's den, chapter 6. Lord willing, we'll get there next quarter. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. What's the fault that the wise men find in Daniel? It's that he prays 3 times a day to his God. This is why he gets thrown in the den of lions, because he is a praying man. So, Daniel responds in prayer to the crisis. Verse 17, then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel and his companions, they pray for mercy because their life is at stake. And we know that corporate prayer works. This is 4 individuals who are praying for the same thing. But we have examples of corporate prayer working in the New Testament. Acts chapter 12, this is on your handout. The church prays for Peter's release after Herod imprisons Peter. And Peter is essentially put in, he says he's put in prison, but this is a death sentence. He's not expected to come out. He's going to be killed. Verse 4 and 5, and when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. That's high security. 4 squads of soldiers. Intending after the Passover to bring him out to the people, so Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the church. What's he intending to do? He's going to bring him out to the people like Pilate brought Christ out. Right? He's not bringing him out to let him go. He's bringing him out so that he can pass judgment and kill him. The church was later stunned when an angel freed Peter, and when the groups of Christians heard about this, they're shocked. But when you pray corporately, God hears. God hears those prayers. When you pray with a few of you, friends or family, and you're praying for something together, God hears those prayers. Nehemiah. Remember Nehemiah. He's the cupbearer to the king of Persia. Now, this is a kingdom that follows Babylon. Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 2 through 6. This is also on your handout. The king said to me, why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This was nothing but sadness of the heart. Then I was very much afraid. He's right there before the king. I said to the king, let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the palace of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire? He's talking about Jerusalem. Then the king said to me, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king. Did you catch that at the end of that verse? So I prayed to the God of heaven. He doesn't exit the room. He's right there having a conversation with the king, and he prays. Have you ever had one of those quick, silent prayers? Maybe you're about to crash into somebody in a car. Help me. He makes a request. I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said to the king, if it pleases the king, and if your servants found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it. And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, how long will you be gone, and when will you return? So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. God can act as swiftly as he desires. And in Nehemiah's case, he acts right away. Swift, silent prayer that's heard. And prayer is often the best response to crisis. Philippians 4, 6 through 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and pleading with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. So, Daniel and his companions pray to God that he would reveal the vision, and he does just that. Verse 19, then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He immediately responds with a prayer of thanksgiving. He praises God's wisdom. He praises God's power. In verse 21 and 22, he changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. So in his prayer, we see the phrase that he removes kings and sets up kings. This foreshadows the dream that Nebuchadnezzar has. He removes kings and sets up kings. This foreshadows the visions that Daniel has in the rest of the book, and it foreshadows the trajectory of the book of Daniel. Completely foreshadows what's about to happen in the book of Daniel, because Daniel is going to have multiple visions. He's going to interpret dreams, and God is going to be the one who's providing all this information to Daniel. And every time he interprets something to a king, he credits God. So this thread of supernatural revelation is going to run from Daniel chapter 2 to Daniel chapter 12. And at the end of verse 22, he says he reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. This contrast of darkness and light, Nebuchadnezzar has a nightmare at night, and what he dreams about is going to be brought to light by Daniel. Verse 23, to you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. He uses the title, O God of my fathers, which acknowledges the God of Israel, the God that has a covenant relationship with the people of Israel. And having praised God, he offers thanks to God, but then he's very specific. He thanks him specifically for what God granted. He says, for you have made known to us the king's matter. You know, when God gives you something, do you remember to go back and thank him? And do you remember to go back and thank him specifically? I forget to do that. But here's a beautiful example of Daniel doing this very thing. Verse 24 and 25, we're going to end with these verses. Daniel returned to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard. Literally translated, Arioch's title is Chief Butcher. Chief Butcher. Okay. Verse 24, then Daniel went into Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Daniel's concerned not only for his life, but for the lives of these other wise men, including his 3 companions. Now watch this in verse 25. Arioch is going to take credit for bringing Daniel to the king. Watch this. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus to him, I have found a man among the exiles from Judah. I have found a man. I found a man among the exiles from Judah, a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. So he follows this claim, I have found, with a little caveat. He throws a note of disdain in for Daniel by saying, I found a man among the exiles from Judah, as if to put him down a little bit. Okay? He's hedging his bets. Right? Because if Daniel's not able to successfully interpret the dream, to tell him the dream, if he fails, guess what? Arioch's off the hook. Well, he's one of those exiles. Okay, next week, Lord willing, we will cover the rest of the chapter and the dream. Thank you for being here.